So you seniors, you graduates, you're at a pinnacle of sorts. With any luck, it won't be the last one. That's one metaphor, a pinnacle. Another, how about a crossroads? You're at a crossroads, right? You're entering a new phase of your life. You're someone different than you were 4 years ago, and hopefully someone better. Likely someone better. And you have another opportunity now to be the next iteration of yourself that you can be. At a crossroads, the metaphor works because you make a decision. You go one direction or another. And there's an old blues idea that you meet the devil at the crossroads. And I always wondered why that was. I thought it through. It's a really compelling idea. It's an image that has a good narrative fit, and it sticks in your memory once you hear it. Why do you meet the devil at the crossroads at midnight? Maybe that's when you examine your conscience, or it examines you. And then you might ask, well, why do you meet the devil at the crossroads? And the answer is, most fundamentally, because when you come to a place in your life where you have to make a choice, and I think this is actually true of every choice we ever make, but it's more evident when the choice is more weighty, let's say, as the choices that lay themselves out now in front of you are weighty. You aim up or down. And there is always an agent of temptation at every choice point enticing you to aim down. And I've thought a lot about what aiming down means, and so I'll run through that for a bit. The spirit of temptation, it manifests itself, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel. And so Cain falls prey to temptation, and God bluntly informs him when he complains about his fate that the temptation was freely chosen and that he could have done differently and better. And Cain becomes, this is in the aftermath of the improper sacrifices that he makes. The sacrifices that he makes that are not everything they could be. They're not in the service of the highest good, that are deceptive and arrogant simultaneously, because when we make improper sacrifices, we believe in the deepest part of ourselves that we've pulled one over God. And I suggest that that's a temptation you might want to avoid, that presumption. And then you might say, well, if you're tempted to aim down, you're tempted to make improper sacrifices, you're tempted to arrogantly presume that you are going to get away from it, with it, that you're not going to be called on it. What are the pathways down that might manifest themselves in front of you? And I think the two stories that follow the story of Cain and Abel detail that. So after Cain and Abel comes the flood. And that's no accident. The narrative placement of those stories is definitely no accident. It's unbelievably sophisticated from a literary perspective, a philosophical perspective, theological perspective, existential perspective. One form of temptation is the nihilistic chaos that's symbolically represented by the flood, right? It's the proliferation of sins. And sin is a word, both its Greek and its Hebrew derivation are related to archery. So the Greek derivation, I hope I haven't got this wrong, because I know there are Greek scholars in this audience. So the word is derived from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, and it's an archery term. It's a lovely notion to know that, because to sin, therefore, means to miss the target, which implies that it has something to do with aim or the lack thereof. I love that. I think it's so apt. And the derivation of the word sin from the Hebrew source actually relies on the same imagery. And so to sin is to aim wrong or to miss the mark. And there's a variety of ways you can miss the mark, right? Don't aim at all. That's a good one. Assume there is no such thing as aim. Assume all aims are equal. Well, you sin, you miss the mark. What can happen? Well, one way is you can descend into a kind of nihilistic hopelessness. And that's not... You can understand that. You meet people in life whose lives have been so hard. You hear their stories. They've suffered so much, and they're bitter, and they're hurt, and they're resentful. And you think, oh my God, it's no wonder you're bitter and hurt and resentful. I mean, look what you've gone through. But you also notice that their bitterness and their resentment and their hopelessness and their chaos and their anxiety, it's not helping, right? It's worsening the problem. It's not making it better. And I'm not saying that people can always resist that, but I've certainly seen that it's not helpful. But I've also met other people, who have had stories equally catastrophic, sometimes more catastrophic, sometimes so catastrophic you can't even believe that they survived, who are not embittered or made resentful by those experiences and who continue to aim up. And so that makes a mockery of a kind of casual determinism, right? Is that you end up chaotic, nihilistic, hopeless, anxious, etc., merely as a consequence of the unbearable tragedy of your life. Because if that was the case, then everyone who had a series of unbearable tragedies, which, by the way, will be almost all of us in one way or another at one time or another, would end up in that catastrophic chaos that if manifested broadly enough in a society, produces a flood that ends everything. And that's the story of Noah in large part. And Noah, he's wise in his generations was a lovely phrase because it means for his time and place he was a good man. And that's a lens through which history might well be viewed. We're very presumptuous, us moderns. We look back and we think, well, this person who did all these remarkable things said these things that we now regard as inappropriate and therefore can be dispensed with. It's like, well, what makes you think that you're above that criticism 100 years from now, that the best you can do is to be as good as you can in your time and place. And if you can manage that, well, good for you. If you can transcend that, well, then maybe you're some sort of saint, and you're probably not. So aiming at just the first is not such a bad upper aim. And so there's the chaos domain, and I would say, those of you who are graduating, you don't want to be tempted into that, One of the things I've thought a lot about in relationship to faith, we have this idea, it's not a good idea, and it's certainly an idea for which religious people are often pilloried, that faith means the sacrifice of reason and the willingness to believe things that are patently not true. And when religious people debate scientists, they're often sort of hung out to dry on exactly those presuppositions, their willingness to accept on principle propositions that seem on the face of them impossible. I don't think that's what faith is at all in some fundamental sense. I think faith is a form of courage. If you're hurt by life, and you will be, it's understandable that you might react in a nihilistic and hopeless fashion and become anxious and depressed and cynical and bitter and all of that. That's a bad pathway. And I think part of what helps you through that is faith. And part of that faith is that it's incumbent upon you, and actually in your best interest and everyone else's, to maintain faith in the fundamental goodness of existence, including your own, despite the evidence to the contrary. Right? Because you can draw conclusions from suffering in two ways, right? One is that you have a duty and perhaps the capability to transcend the suffering and still serve the good, or you can derive the conclusion that life is so unbearable that it would be best terminated, which is the conclusion that Goethe's Mephistopheles derives, for example, in Faust. He says, well, the world is rife with suffering, and it's so unbearable that consciousness itself, all beings should cease to exist. That would be better. Nothing is better than something if something is rife with suffering. And you can derive that conclusion, and you'll be driven to it in some of the farther reaches of your life when terrible things happen to you. But I would say faith is the courage to not take that path despite the evidence that might be justified. And so I think it is a form of courage in the highest sense. And I also think it is a redeeming form of courage. One of the things I told my daughter, who was very, very ill for a very long period of time and in tremendous pain and suffering the high probability of continued slow, painful, inevitable degeneration, was do not take advantage of your illness as an excuse. And I told her that when she was in grade 2. It's no joke to tell someone that, because I knew she'd had every reason to be embittered. But I also knew that if she was, in combination with her illness, the two things might be worse than fatal. And, if you don't think there are things that are worse than fatal, you have not suffered, because there are things that are much worse than fatal. And there's certainly not something you want to doom your child to. So that's one temptation, right? That's the temptation of kind of faithless hopelessness. And an anomie, you might say, existential angst that you allow to pervade yourself. And I'm not saying you won't have your reasons. because you will. I'm saying that the reasons don't justify the conclusion, and they certainly don't justify the conclusion, not self-evidently.